We are students of the art of play,
And we do this show called The Art of Play.
a show for the players who ask why.
I'm Vi.
And I'm Gaia.
Gaia, welcome to Helenia. If you were a songbird flying from east over the once great quartz cliffs and sailing with the updraft of the falls near there, on a clear day you might see a great expanse of land and ocean, distantly the forests of the west and the pastures of the east. But today is not a clear day, and you can only see the fog and maybe the glow from the mellow pinnacle melting into the distance. As you fly, from the mist a warrior's sword, huge and chipped from battles with time, you might alight on this ancient statue for a moment before lofting on the spiraling air currents of the storm-crashed sea, again flying to the west. As this bird, choosing to fly low in the cool spring mist of this early, early morning, you might be scanning for those first morsels of your morning. As you glance through the frost-touched grass along the road, you might sail above the dirt path, worn with cart tracks, and see a small town and its sign in the mist ahead. And maybe, if you're this bird, and you alight on this branch with us at just the right time, you might see a peddler coming up this road, using a trident as a walking staff. Now, Gaia, you're going to introduce our topic in a minute here. But that is an example of an intro from a D&D game that I DM'd, where we then went into prologues with each character individually as they met up and became a party.
Well, welcome to our episode on the first 5 minutes in gaming. As you heard from Vi today, we're going to be going into great detail on how you, as either a DM or a player, can perceive the first little bit of a game and how that impacts the enjoyment or just generally the tone of the rest of the game as a whole, and why you, as a player or DM, should care about this as a concept. Now, Vi has presented us with a beautiful opening to a story, one that, as far as I know, is one of your favorite books, if I'm not mistaken.
No, I wrote that.
Wait, you wrote this one?
I wrote that. That was something I wrote for Helenia.
Oh, okay. I thought you were pulling that from a book. It is very well written. So
thank you. I do have 4 books in front of me, ready with.
That's why I thought you were reading one.
No, thank you though. I think it's important when we talk about the first 5 minutes of anything, is the idea that it hooks a player in.
Exactly.
Right? It's that first pull that doesn't let you go. It's that thing that sparks curiosity and brings you into the story really quickly.
Exactly.
And I know you have a couple of main ideas. Do you want to run us through a couple of them?
Yeah, so I'll kind of lay out the format of today's episode and why you as the viewer or listener should care. And in this layout, I will talk about which our main topics will be. So starting off today's episode, we're going to be talking about what makes a good hook. Simply the idea of when you are writing or planning, what you can do to hook an audience in so they want to read or play more of what you've created. We're then going to be talking about the 3 major themes around your hooks, which are narratives, gameplay or mechanics, and spectacle. And then we'll be concluding, as we always do, with a bit of a discussion on tabletop RPGs and what you can do as a DM or a player in these games to put the concepts of the first 5 minutes to use.
For sure. Well, I know that your first topic here is going to be a strong title. That's going to be part of your first 5 minutes. That's your first impression, right?
Yeah. So
I know
that's
that we
a
always
big
say
part of the hook.
Yeah, we always say don't judge a book by its cover, but you very much do judge a book by its cover.
You
right?
always
That's
judge a book
going
by its
to be
cover.
It's going to be the first thing that drags you in.
That's why there are covers.
Yes. Do you have a favorite book that has a good cover, or a favorite video game that has a really good name and cover?
Yeah, I actually do. And I know I talk about this game a lot. And I know that my discussions in a little bit are going to be about this game again. But I find that the game Persona 5 has one of my favorite covers. Right on the front, it is a major deep red with dark colored themes of all of the characters kind of exploding from the middle with the Persona 5 logo in the center. It doesn't portray too much of the concepts of the game, except that the game is about characters. But it's really cool, and it made me interested just with how striking it was as a photo. One of the first times I was looking at playing Persona. But how about you, Vi? Do you have like a favorite title, favorite cover?
The one I'm going to use as an example is a book called Leviathan Wakes by James Corey. First of all, that cover, Leviathan Wakes, is really, really strong. Like, there's something there that really drags you in. Like, you want to know, like, Leviathan is obviously like a big thing, right? Leviathan from the Bible is a big sea monster, I think. And like, Leviathan Wakes is very scary. And then on the cover of this book is kind of a spaceship that looks a little bit like a sea monster, maybe if you squint. So it's kind of unclear why they're talking about like what Leviathan is and why it's waking, but it's a really strong title to provoke questions. And I think that's really important.
Exactly. So what I want to do is not just talking about titles and covers, but I want to go through the main points that I sent you earlier, Vi, and really talk about the different types of hooks. I think what we can do is each of us go through one item as like a personal thing and give an example of something that makes use of it. Now, we've already talked about a strong title, so allow me to jump in as the person presenting item 2 when making a good hook for your game or book. And this is to put your players or your readers into the action. The simplest way of this, I know I use this example a lot, but is to pull back again to the Persona series. So in Persona 5, the game opens with you as a player starting running away from... It's the police in this case, and you don't really know why you're being chased by the cops. But you're above what looks to be a casino or a museum, running along the rafters while people are looking at you and pointing, and it appears as if you're stealing something. So the very first thing you do in the game is you are sprinting, trying not to get caught by the authorities, and the scene ends with you jumping through a stained glass window and landing perfectly, and then getting caught in an ambush.
That's awesome.
It's an amazing opening. I love this idea of games open with action, noise, volume, something cool to make you feel good. And when we talk a bit more later on about the various ways of doing an intro, it's an amazing both narrative and mechanical intro at the same time. But we have more points to get through, and I'll pass the die over to you.
Yeah, I will just say that in like writing properly, that's called putting somebody in media res, opening in media res, opening in the moment. So a lot of places, a lot of books will do this too, right? That's the idea of like you open into like a fight scene, right? And you're just there, and you go along for the ride from there.
Yeah, you make something cool and interesting and dynamic. Especially, that's the key word I want someone to take from this. Dynamic.
Yes.
For those who are reading or playing.
This would be the opposite of like the Belgariad opening with like 7 pages of prologue that is just straight up lore.
So the opposite of Tolkien?
Yes, I do actually have the Lord of the Rings in front of me as an example for the next one. The next one is forming an emotional connection. And I'm sure you have an example for this, but I want to show an example of it. So here is chapter 1. This is not the prologue of the Lord of the Rings. Of course, chapter 1, A Long Expected Party. When Mr. Bilbo Baggins of Bag End announced that he would shortly be celebrating his 111st birthday with a party of special magnificence, there was much talk and excitement in Hobbiton. Right away, you're like, 111st?
111st.
111st is funny, which I think speaks to like Bilbo's character a little bit. So you get this idea that like you're starting to form an emotional connection here of like, hey, that's kind of charming. I kind of like the idea of, you know, this is going to be such a big birthday party that all of Hobbiton, wherever that is excited about it. And I think that's very special to make an emotional connection to a place and a person. But this could also be very specifically like you need to make an emotional connection by saving something in a video game.
Right. If I can also jump in here a little bit. Our next item is very related to this and might actually help in with this a lot, and that is the idea of making a surprising statement. Now, when we talk about statements, we don't particularly mean saying something shocking. You can't start pulling out offensive language and calling that a surprising statement. But instead, something needs to shock the viewer. I think back to Fallout, I think 3 in this case, where the first thing that you do is you're digging a grave, and the game opens with you being shot into the grave. Like, you're shot standing next to it and you fall back into the grave, right? And the game opens with that narrative. The player has already been shot, right?
Yeah, and that's not a surprising... It's not a surprising statement so much as it is just a surprise.
Yeah, and there's some statements with it as to why that's happening, but it's really throwing you into the deep end of Fallout from the starting point, where you are being, killed after digging your own grave, which is incredibly intense and shocking for the player.
Yeah, and it also, I've read books that do start with just like a swear.
Yes.
As something meant to be shocking, but
I think John Green does that a lot in his books.
They also tend to be immediately followed up with like a moment of humor or like something that immediately sort of countermands like why a person is swearing.
Yeah.
Like it's usually like strong language backed up with like something kind of silly, which sort of does that same thing of like forming an emotional connection where you're like, oh yeah, I would totally do that same thing in this situation. Like, tell me more about that.
Yeah, and I think in Fallout, this actually might be a different game, but if I'm remembering it correctly, the next scene has someone putting your brain back together. Like it's already happened. He's like, oh, hey, you're finally up. I put your brain back together. So there's that humor aspect right after it, too.
Yeah, and I think those things are really strong when they're paired correctly, right? When you sort of do the same amount of one thing as you do the other, right? You surprise a player and then you comfort them the same way. But they also should, like, maybe explain something about the world. Like, oh, I put your brain back together? Oh, I know that I'm playing something sci-fi, right?
Right. And Fallout is an amazing candidate for that. It's its whole genre.
Yeah, for sure. But it also leads your player with questions, which is the next one on our list here.
Point number 5.
Which is to start your player asking questions, but also to ask a prompting question of your players. This could be in a D&D world something like, what do you do? Where do you go? Right? Like those sorts of things after a little bit of a description. In those first 5 minutes, you immediately offer somebody a choice.
Yeah, exactly. I don't have too many examples for questions, but I can think of an intro that I personally feel is a bad intro, but did the question example very well. And maybe you can also talk about this, Vi. That's the opening to Skyrim. It starts with you in the back of a cart being carted away to, well, I know I've talked about this concept already, but to your execution. And someone's telling you you're about to be executed, and you're stuck there like, what happened?
So fun fact, I've never played Skyrim.
Let's pretend you did.
Sure, okay.
But it does open up with you wondering, what's going on? Why is my character being executed? What have I done wrong? Who is in this cart with me? Where are we going?
For sure. Yeah, it's definitely, again, in those first 5 minutes of you are asking questions about the world and asking questions about the story and the, like, narration that's happening in that moment to try to make sense of it. There was this meme that I remember seeing a while back, somebody being like, oh yeah, the first page of any sci-fi fantasy novel is like, this string of stuff that you don't understand, right?
Exactly.
Like on the cliffs of such and such a place, you're a seeker, and as a seeker you know that this and that and the other thing, you're like, okay, I think I understand. I had this moment of realization earlier. I'm on the 3rd book of the Stormlight Archives, and I just got back into it because I'm sick, so I did go to class today. And I was like reading it, and I remember just being like, oh yeah, I have so many questions about this world, and I'm still in the 3rd book. And then I opened up the 1st book of The Way of Kings, and I was reading the first page, and I was like, oh yeah, I remember understanding absolutely none of this, right? And now I'm going back and reading it and being like, oh, I know what all that means. That all makes sense now.
I would love to read a book that does that, but just uses real life concepts just for the humor. Like when you said the cliffs example, my first thought was you awaken on the cliffs of Dover. Which I think would be hilarious as an opening. It would also have more questions and answers for the reader.
Yeah, it could be really fun to read something that is like written by somebody who's imagining Earth as a like fantasy novel.
Right. Oh my gosh, that would be amazing.
That could be so bittersweet.
You need to get a biologist to write it.
Yeah, I think that would be one of those ones where it's like, I know that this like pine tree does this photosynthesis thing, and I'm thinking about how it's drawing sugar up from the ground, and I'm drawing air into my lungs, just like that tree is exhaling it. Like, it would be one of those, like...
It would have to be.
It would have to be so bittersweet. It would have to be like almost a romance. It would have to be somebody coming back from the dead to experience all of the things that they loved again.
Right. Though, imagine reading a book that describes trees as monstrous, towering beasts of plant matter that that like suck the sugar and the water out of the ground. Like, you could do that description, and it's just a tree.
And it is just a tree.
But this does lead in a little bit to our next point when starting a game and starting a story, and that's to avoid heavy description, right? Have you ever read a book where the early moments felt like pages and pages and pages of narration and description and terms and names and proper noun after proper noun after proper noun?
The Belgariad, I'm looking directly at you. Like, it's that book. I do have it. It's just over in a bookshelf. That book, the first 10, maybe 15 pages are the like creation lore of the world. And the second volume starts in exactly the same way. But it's one of those things where it's like, oh, that's an interesting concept. And then you read a little bit more and you're like, how in the world is this relevant?
Yeah.
But it does kind of do something interesting that I think is kind of fun. Where as you like learn more about the world, you start to connect it back to that like opening thing about like the gods and like the high mythos of the world, where you're like, hang on a minute, are you trying to tell me that this guy knew that person from the lore thing that I just read? Like, it kind of like the word I'm looking for is like counter into it. It's like it's one of those things where you're like, yeah, whatever, lore. And I'm going to put that in the back of my head because I've read fantasy before. I know how this works. Right. But then you read it and it's like, oh, that guy's just ancient. He just knows these people.
But if I can jump in a little bit.
Please do.
A really important aspect of this is also to understand what not to do. For everything previous, we've been talking about good things, but when avoiding description, allow me to paint a picture. Imagine that you were reading The Lord of the Rings, and you know when you get to Rivendell, and you get to the council where they make an argument to put together a team of people to send to cast the ring into the volcano. And there's that whole scene of, you have my bow and my sword and my axe.
Yeah.
If you read the books, in that scene, there is a 8-page set of narrative exposition by, I think it's Gandalf who gives this one, talking about his adventures prior. Now, we're like 10 chapters, or I think this is on chapter 7 when you get into the book, so you're deep in the book by now. Imagine if the book opened with that narration.
It would be way too much. It would be really hard. My other thought of this, when I saw it on our list of things to avoid, was simply that it takes you out of the story for a second.
It does. It turns you into a reader rather than a member of the story.
One of the things I will always say about books and video games is they are two mediums of storytelling that allow you to interact with the story. There really isn't another, like, aside from tabletop gaming, there isn't another medium that lets you do that, right? Anything
even
that is,
books struggle with it versus video games.
Well, so books allow you to be in the moment, like, with the person, right?
Yes.
And because you tend to read it along with them and you tend to understand their motivations and stuff like that, you tend to experience the story more fully than you do when it's presented to you in a movie or TV show. Like, I always find myself walking away from a movie or a TV show being like, that was interesting. I liked it. I maybe cried because I found it emotional. But I'm never changed, I think, fundamentally by a TV show or a movie. But I will say that, you know, every time I put down a book, I'm like, something clicked. I understood, you know, even if it's just one moment of somebody's narration or, like, motives. There's a really excellent book that is totally terrifying because of this reason.
Right.
So the series is the Baru Cormorant books. I don't remember who they're by at the moment, but The first one, the traitor Brew Cormorant. So you follow this young woman who is sort of swept up into a very political, world as one of the political elite. And you watch her make the worst choices. And I don't mean the worst as in like, hey, that's a bad choice. I mean like the most like morally incorrect choices for all of the right reasons. Like you're watching her do all this stuff and then she straight up like kills people that she loves and like and betrays people and follows like this is spoilers obviously for the rest of this, but she at one point is like part of a resistance, like a rebellion in this one country. And she's like got all these people on her side and she's like wrangled all of the political everybody over to this side of the rebellion. And she figures out, how they're getting all their money and how they're like laundering stuff in it. And it's all very clever. And she falls in love with somebody. And right at the end of the book, it's like revealed that she did all of that to bring down all of the political leaders of that country. So she like makes herself into a traitor against the like big political oppressors and then betrays the rebellion. And you're watching her do all of these choices. And I remember reading this and being like, I think my brain is broken because I still agree with her. But I'm terrified because I'm agreeing with her. Like, it was a book that I had to, like, put down and, like, walk away from multiple times.
If I may jump in on that, that's actually the same plot sequence that is followed by the show Code Geass, which had the same effect on me, but in show form, where the main character joins a rebellion and later betrays that rebellion, doing the worst possible things for all the right reasons.
Yeah, it's really troubling when you, like, have the attention of, or, like, when you are so invested in a character and in a story, and then to, like, watch them make the choices that are right for them, but so wrong. Like, in Baru, you're watching Baru at one point kill her lover at the very end, and she's like, yeah, I don't care about her anyway. And it's like, What are you talking about? Like, you love her. What is happening here? And I'm like a romantic at heart, so I'm reading this being like, I know you don't have another choice here, but like you could have kept her alive. Like, this is very much a moment where you have choice and you're choosing the option that is the scariest, but also the strongest because it leaves her like independent and stuff. But anyway, it's fantastic and terrible.
But on that, to bring us back to the discussion of intros and hooks rather than concluding a story, I believe we have one major point left. And I think you got into that a little bit with your previous discussion, but would you like to introduce it to us?
Sure. This is the idea of like, once you have the attention, keep it, right? Once you're through those first 5 minutes and you've hooked somebody, do your very, very best to keep them rolling with it.
Yeah, and on this, a lot of our previous principles hold in their own unique way. A lot of the principles we've given you so far are how to do a very strong first 5 minutes. You need something amazing to pull someone in the first place. You need to give them action or emotion or shock or questions to make them want to continue. But once you have them, you have to have sustenance. There we go.
Sure.
For the reader, for the player to engage with, something for them to continue that they want to do. I think Persona did it very well when I talk about this, Persona 5, in that the intro is action, but once you get through the action, it is a very long period of very interesting narration for the player to listen to and engage with.
I can give you a poor example of this.
Let's hear a poor example of it. A game with something with a great hook that just doesn't keep you.
The first, 3 hours of Skyward Sword, where like the first 5 minutes, I'm like, ooh, cool concept. Okay, I'm in. I'm interested in what's happening here. And then it's like cutscene, and then you go play for 5 minutes, and then it's like cutscene, then you go play for 5 minutes. And it's a cutscene, then you play for 5 minutes, and then they're like, and now you get to go down to the real world. And I'm like, what was I doing up here?
To be fair, I think Persona does the same thing, but when Persona does it, it's a game built around cutscenes, so it doesn't feel as jarring.
But Skyward Sword, I was like, yes, a Zelda game. Let me play a video game. And then it was like, why don't you just watch about a million cutscenes? Like, this is a game that I was like, I've had it. I'm done. I like didn't finish. Wasn't interested.
Yeah. So from this gives you a series of 7 major steps to consider when working on your hook for media. The first and the last being for everything, well, the first and the last 2, and the other 4 being different strategies you can take. And I'll summarize these, and then we can kind of move on into a discussion of more on how to apply the greater thematic concepts in your hook. So to list out our 7, just so that everyone can remember them concisely, maybe write them down if you have some pen and paper with you. You want a strong title, and then you want to either put your players into the action, or form an emotional connection, or make a surprising statement, or lead your player with questions, or any mixture of these. And then you want to conclude with avoiding heavy description, and once you get the reader or player's attention, you keep it.
I would love to read you the first sentence of The Way of Kings.
Let's do the first sentence, and then we'll take a short break and jump back into it.
Totally. Okay, here we go. Shazeth, son Villano, truthless of Shinovar, wore white on the day he was to kill a king. The white clothing was a Pershendi tradition, foreign to him, but he did as his masters required and did not ask for an explanation.
Huh.
Yeah. This is, again, a great example because that was the first sentence of a book that hooked me into a 4-book series of books that are like 1,000 pages each.
God.
Definitely kept my attention. I think the strongest part of that is that you get a lot of like, this is going to be, these books are kind of famous for their world building, right? So you get a lot of like, well, this is a weird name format, right? Why are you son Villano? That doesn't mean anything to me. Why are you truthless of what I assume to be a place? You wore white on the day that you were to kill a king. That's super strong. And then we know that that's not your tradition and that you are somehow you are subservient to some sort of master. And then I was like, and I'm going to keep reading that.
And with that, we're going to take a short break, and we'll be back in, for you, the listener, a few seconds, for us, a couple of minutes, where we're going to be going into the various themes that you can apply into your hooks when writing a story or making a game. We'll see you in a bit.
The scopuli had been taken 8 days ago, and Julie Mao was finally ready to be shot.
And welcome back to our discussion on strong hooks and strong openings in gaming. So, prior we had discussed our main ideas for how to produce a hook, and now we want to talk about the various themes in creating these hooks that you as a player or as a reader might want to consider, especially in the topics of video games and TTRPGs. So,
I'm just going to give credit. That opening is the first line of Leviathan Wakes by James Corey.
And it gives us a very strong way to start with our list of one of the themes that you can use for an opening. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but when you're making a game, you have a lot more than simple text to sell your player on. And the strategies we've given you about text only really work in the concept of, well, writing. And when it comes to games, we have a lot more mechanical and visual strategies that we can use. But we've talked a lot about books already. So the first theme that you can choose to do in video games or TTRPGs or whatever you might choose to create or work with is that of narrative.
Yeah, this is the idea that you are selling the player on the story, the world, the tone. This is, again, like this has a huge element of mystery, right? This is
right.
I'm introducing you to a world, and don't you want to know, like, what's coming next? Don't you want to know just a little bit more about that?
Yeah.
So this is very much like the idea of starting with maybe something of like a big lore drop, right? So something like The Witcher 3 that starts with like a big narration about, something very dramatic, right? Like we've got like the conjunction of the spheres and what that meant for the world to introduce you to the fact that this is a world that is fundamentally at war, where there are monsters and where there are people who are outcasts, who are paid to fight the monsters, which are the
Right.
Witchers, and you're now going to play as a Witcher. And then you fundamentally understand where that character is coming from, right? You go,
Yeah.
okay, I know that I'm an outcast. I know that the world is fundamentally pretty scary, and I'm sold. Like, let's go.
Yeah, and when we're talking about story and narrative, it doesn't have to be the main plot, right? Many games will sell you on aspects of the story that might not necessarily belong to this plot. If I can give a really good example, The Last of Us is one of the best for what it does. Now, the hardest thing that you can sell your player on is the characters, as characters require a lot of time and emotional connection and effort to make you like them. Usually you need hours upon hours with them. But The Last of Us starts you as, if I recall correctly, a father spending time with their kids as the entire world is about to go to hell around them. And it has this very emotional, calm bonding moment before everything just collapses.
And I will say that, characters you need a long time to understand, but it doesn't take a very long time for you to like somebody, or to.
Though it can be very hard to make the player like them.
Yeah, but it can be a very quick thing. It can be something as simple as like, oh, I think this person's funny. Like I remember reading, like the Percy Jackson series and being like, oh, I get it. Okay, Percy's kind of funny. Like I'm in. Right? Like it can be very easy to like somebody on a first impression.
Yeah, and I want to give one more example, but I really want to make sure that we're able to get into the next two topics after, as that's where the video games and TTRPGs really shine. But one of my favorite games for introducing an early story, and a mystery especially, is Hacknet. Hacknet, which is hard to say out loud, I have to admit, was this small hacking simulation game made by a single guy in Australia that opens up with you on this new operating system designed specifically for hacking, which real-life things like that exist. And you get this email, which turned out to be a failsafe, that says, if you're reading this email, then I'm already dead. And it's from the guy who created the OS, and it starts off this massive hacking-themed puzzle game that is based on a murder mystery of trying to understand what happened to Bit. I think his name was Bit, at least.
Yeah, I feel like that's a really classic, like, opening.
It
like,
is.
if you're reading this, I'm already dead.
But getting it as an email while you're hacking into terminals is a whole different feeling. Like, you're just going in like, I'm connected to a little computer. Let's go do a little hack. And then suddenly you get this, like, vroom sound effect.
Yeah.
And you have an email, and it's from a guy you've never seen, never met, and it opens with, I need your help. If you're reading this, I'm already dead.
Yeah, this is definitely back to our, like, make a surprising statement.
Yeah, and it's a huge thematic shift in that moment. You're going through just like hacking a little computer, learning the mechanics, and suddenly someone's dead and you're the person who has to figure out what happened.
Yeah, that's really strong because it immediately asks a lot of questions of you.
Yeah, and you've had the chance to learn what the game feels like, so you're like, oh, cute little hacking game. Oh, God.
Oh dear, yeah.
So
well, and it immediately also introduces stakes. Like somebody's dying.
It does.
Yeah, and that's huge too. I think that's one of the things that we've sort of missed talking about is a lot of these things start you in a place where like the stakes are very, very high in everything, right?
Yeah,
we're
there's
talking
a reason
about
you need to care.
There's a reason you need to care, but there's also kind of an element of like, I need to care because it's important that I care.
Exactly.
Cool. Let me introduce our second point here.
This is my favorite one for today's topic.
Of course,
so our viewers know this is my bread and butter.
Yeah, absolutely. So the second idea is to hook you on mechanics, right? So maybe something really cool like a combat mechanic or strong movement, or maybe starting you in a fight and being like, this is how you fight.
Yeah, so this is the gameplay side of things, where we've spent so long talking about narratives, because let's face it, the tricks from narratives are what we're using. Some games aren't based around narrative. I have an example in my document, I think Vi will agree with this as well, of Mario 64. How does Mario 64 open? You're in a field, and you have to go enter the castle to do castle things before going into a level. So what do? You run, and you jump, and you backflip, and you mash button controls, and you read signs, and you explore, right? The first thing you do in Mario 64 is test your mechanics. And Mario 64 has some of the best movement of any 3D platformer you can imagine. It's very fluid, it has a lot of options, a lot of room for follow-up, and you can get very good at it. So it opens up very powerfully for those who care about this type of mechanic.
I will also say that Breath of the Wild starts like this, right? You get a whole bunch of like story stuff, and then you come to out of your deep sleep in a little cave, and then you go
In a small little cave,
and you navigate your way out of the little cave. You find a box that I think has pants in it, and then right,
I think so, yes.
You climb up a little thing, and you come out of this little cave, and you're immediately greeted by this like huge world, which is super thematic for the game. But you also just got to play with like, okay, I can climb, I can jump, I can open things, right? And that also speaks to just what Breath of the Wild is about.
Yeah, and I think for a lot of you who might play puzzle games, you know exactly what this feels like. Nearly every puzzle game opens up with you on a simple puzzle for you to learn how to do the puzzles, and then you have this moment of it zooming out and showing you the whole landscape, the whole world of puzzles you will be solving. And it's just this moment of, that little thing I did, that's just the beginning, isn't it?
Yes, that's the oh no, I'm going to have to learn how to do a whole lot of other stuff.
Oh no, there is a game here. And platformers do this too. Most games without a lot of story open you up with a simple example of the gameplay, and then they zoom out.
I feel like we're going to talk about Spelunky again, right?
I just saw that in my game list, and I was like, oh yeah, we should probably talk about Spelunky.
Yeah, this is very much the like, hey, why don't you try playing this game just for fun, right? Here's a level, doesn't mean anything. Just give it a go.
Yeah, the first tutorial level being one that you can speedrun. It gives you a timer and forces you to do every single mechanical option that exists in the game, but in a way that feels good, in a way that is fun, and feels like a normal, kind of like speed challenge to learn the mechanics.
Yeah, it's a way of introducing just like, hey, this is about fun. Like, figure it out. That's
Exactly.
very, very specific and honestly pretty fun.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of how Spelunky operates this stuff, but I find a lot of other games do this really well too. This might sound weird, but the game Undertale, for being so narratively heavy, actually doesn't open on narration. It opens on a fight with Flowey, where he tells you to go pick up the little white friendliness pellets while you're moving your character around and understanding the battle system. And then he betrays you.
Yeah.
And tries to kill you.
Very reasonable, I think.
It's a mixed opening, a bit of mechanics, a bit of narrative, but you really are opening up on all of the gameplay options that exist, and then it does the narrative for you.
Yeah, and again, this is the first 5 minutes. There's actually quite a lot that you can pack into 5 minutes, right? You can do all of the above, right? You can get sold on the narrative, and you can get hooked on the mechanics, and you can do the third thing, which I think, Gaia, you maybe want to introduce.
I do, and I'm going to introduce the third topic by taking actually one that I put into the mechanics section of my notes and saying, this is both.
Sure.
The final option is spectacle. Some amazing, massive thing that gets your player like, wow, this is huge. Puzzle games incorporate this a little bit, although they're primarily mechanical. But one of my favorite games that does this is Just Cause 3. Or Just Cause. You're supposed to say it as cause because like you have your cause, your reason for fighting is just.
Yes,
it's a pun.
your raison d'etre. Yeah, I understand.
Yeah. Just Cause 3 has you start the game standing on the wing of an airplane mid-flight, holding a rocket launcher, shooting at enemy anti-air missile systems with your rocket launcher.
Yes, perfectly reasonable.
While someone talks to you on like a radio or whatever.
Yeah.
You're standing on a flying plane with a rocket launcher.
Yeah.
It is silly, it is intense, it gives you an overview of pretty much the entire map in a very short period of time, and it feels amazing.
Right.
You are so cool in these few seconds.
This comes back to, again, our like discussion on tutorials, right? You want to make the player feel cool. You want to be doing something that makes you feel good.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, and I think that's super powerful when you have games that start with spectacle, but that spectacle is also you doing something cool. I was going to go with, I was going to talk about just Breath of the Wild for a second, where like you come out of the cave and it's like, look at this huge world, and you're standing there and the feeling is just like, I don't know what's going on. I know that something happened, but like, wow, that's a lot of world for me to figure out.
That's a lot of world.
It's a different kind of spectacle for sure.
And I think this sounds wild, but I'm going to pull an example that Vi would have seen in one of our chats last night, embarrassingly, from the new Sonic game that just came out.
Oh my god. Okay, yeah.
Sonic Frontiers, I haven't played it yet, but it opens up in like this massive, amazing open world, right? Where you have the chance to explore and run around at high speeds, and you fight very early on, this giant mech thing that is an absolutely wild fight, right?
Yeah.
And it's just this constant, you went from this little Sonic, these small 2D levels of moving with speed, to an open world, hard, like 2000s metal rock, just going wild on it, like supersonic speed. It feels amazing, and it's a spectacle because of this massive open area you get to see, and just this wow moment you get with what Sonic has produced.
Yeah, it's very much something that takes what you expect and flips it on you. It's like, we know Sonic. He's like kind of a cute guy. He's got sneakers, right? And then it's
he's cool, and he likes chili dogs.
Yeah, and it's like, or he's a massive superstar, and look how fast he can go. Which is a really fun way to start a video game, right? Because the whole point of gaming, of reading, of playing a tabletop RPG is like, you want to feel cool. You want to feel good about what you're doing.
And I know how funny it is, but Sonic really does feel cool.
Yeah, look, no one has ever debated the fact that Sonic is cool. I don't think anyone's ever looked at Sonic Blue Hedgehog and thought, that's a silly guy. No, we're all like, Sonic's
He's a little
cool.
bit of a silly guy.
No. We all know that Sonic is a good look. We all know. Gaia, look at me. We all know that Sonic is cool. We all know that inherently. We come out of the womb and we're like, I know what's cool, and it's a blue hedgehog with sneakers.
Exactly. So, there's one more spectacle I want to say, and this is the opposite from all of the vibes that we've been saying so far. You're playing, I think it's Fallout New Vegas, because that's the game that I own, and I know that I played this part. And you're in like a little 1950s house, and someone knocks on the door from Vault Tech saying, hey, would you like to pay to get into like a vault in case nuclear war happens? And then the sirens go off, and you're told you have to rush to the vault because there's a possibility that you're about to be nuked.
Yeah.
So you run to the vault while people are screaming and running and begging to get in, and you have your ID that lets you in, and you're standing on the platform about to go down to the vault, and you're looking over at the distance because you're on a hill, and as you look over the distance, you see a nuke go off in your city as you're descending into the vault. And that moment is exhilarating, it's terrifying, and the nuke goes off, and you are panicking.
Yes, I think as you should be. But also that's again the, like, we talk about a thing that it makes you feel something when you're hooked in the first 5 minutes, and that's something that, like, yeah, there's a lot of fear there, but it's also like, oh, but the game doesn't stop here. Like, we just stopped with what I thought was probably one of the worst outcomes, and there's still game. So, okay, so what's next? What happens after this?
Yeah, and I have to admit, I know it's a little bit of cheating, but the Fallout series has amazing openings. That's what they do. They're a post-apocalyptic world where nuclear war happened. Of course they are going to have good openings.
Yes,
it's hard not to have good openings.
Yeah, but they've also tapped into something that's very specific, right? Like, they've tapped into...
primal fear.
No, I was going to say a very, like, recognizable image, right? I was going to do something like, oh, yeah, we know the 50s, right? Like, we know the 50s where there's, like, big mushroom clouds and people are afraid of that, and we understand that. I know where I am, right? That's a very clear image to be able to pull from, right? So, of course, they're going to start with that retro feeling. They're going to tap into that moment of time.
Yeah, pull from something familiar and then flip it on its head so you have a sudden realization of, the familiar is gone.
Yes. And I think that's very powerful.
I think so. So we've exhausted most of our lists of themes, and our themes, there's many options. Narrative, gameplay, huge, major spectacle event. So let us take the last few minutes we have and open a bit of a discussion on you're either a player or a game master for a game of some tabletop RPG. How can you take what we just said and apply it to your games? Now, I know, Vi, you've been working on lots of games recently. You've been joining new ones. You've been making new ones. How would you put these types of principles into practice for your own games?
Well, as somebody who writes as a hobby, this is one of the things where I feel very in my wheelhouse about. And I think in tabletop RPGs, you get a really good chance to speak to the things that you've talked about in your session 0 with players, right? This is where you get to say, I listened to you, I heard you, we're going to do a murder mystery, right? This is where you get to introduce everybody to the theme of the world. This is a little bit like your trailer, if you will, for what's coming. So if you're going to sit down with all of your friends at a big old table, right, and you go, okay, everybody, shush, we're going to start, right? And everybody does their last little page flip, laptop noise, last roll of the dice, right? And everybody
Tippity tap.
Yes, everybody kind of settles for a second and looks at you. This is where you get to
listen to the DM.
Yes, this is where you get to flip your music from whatever you were listening to get started to, something fun to narrate, right?
Right.
Something very clear. Like for Helenia, I used page 47, which is from the National Treasure soundtrack, because it fits so well into the narration that I used at the top of the show. And the way that I tend to introduce players to shows into stories is to say, we're going to, in Helenia, we're talking about a big world that we had just built together, right? This was a very collaborative story that we were telling. And because we had built the world together, I wanted to show them all of it up front. So I was the way to do that is to take on this persona of if you were a bird, because this is a high fantasy world that is very, very close to that Studio Ghibli feeling of there's spirits in everything. There's a little bit of mystery, right? So saying that if you were a bird, I'm not saying that you are. I'm not even saying that you can see through birds or that this bird exists. If you were a bird and you could fly from this side of the world to the other side of the world, here are some things you might see. Putting players into the action of seeing everything, and they've already formed an emotional connection to this world because we had all just built it together. And then to say something mildly surprising in that introduction, because this is kind of a very chill game, was to start by saying, if it was a clear day, but it's not a clear day, setting the tone for what we're doing right now.
Right.
And then you always want to have a moment where in a tabletop RPG, you let the player describe their own character. And in that game, we had done, everybody gets their own little prologue where I had set up a little problem for each of them. So they all got a little bit of time to form emotional connections to their characters, to this specific part of the world. We had somebody who was leaving home for the first time, so we had a goodbye with their parents and a oh, don't forget to close the garden door on your way out, that sort of thing. We had somebody stop and help fix a sign before leading them all together with a sort of well, here's a problem in the town square, what do you want to do, while avoiding some of that heavier description, though that game was very, very heavily based in narration of moments and places. On the other hand, we could start somewhere the game that we're playing in on Fridays, where I think I gave a broad, this is what the city looks like, isn't it nice to start in a morning like this? And then I was except that everything's super busy and you guys are all lost.
Would you like me to talk about the Friday game as well?
Yeah, please do.
So to jump in here, a lot of people might notice that tabletop RPGs take longer than 5 minutes to introduce. So to be a little generous, let's say the first half an hour or so is usually a bit better because you're working with so many other people who have input and questions and things to say. And in your game, Vi, what ends up happening is you give us this big narration of the city and the landscape. You're really doing the let's introduce you to the world opening, right? And then you sit us down and say, a big ceremony is about to happen. You guys are all, for some reason, near a ship. I'm playing a character who's a tourist who looks at a map and is like, wow, one hell of a celebration, right?
Yeah.
And you tell us everyone is panicking who has work to do for the preparations. And we happen to be in the midst of them, and they're trying to kind of pull us in to help, right? And we have this crisis of we have to get this item to an item like a relic to the, I think, church or cathedral or city center, university space, so that they can do the ritual that the whole celebration's about. And there's this problem-solving, heavy action, heavy mechanic-based. You have half the time you need to travel to that location. How are you getting it there as a team when it's too heavy for any one person to lift?
Yes, I think part of my, one of the things I will say about that moment is that I just set up a problem. And I was like, and you guys get to solve it in whatever way you want, which is a really good way to introduce brand new players who had never played D&D before to the idea that D&D isn't just about, combat, right?
Right.
I could have started
or
with,
roleplay.
Or role play. I could have started with you guys are in the middle of a fight, but I was like, I don't really want to do that. I want you guys to come together in a way that isn't about fighting, because we're going to get to combat later. Right?
Yeah, and that opening is common to the starter set for the Lost Mines of Foundelver, where you are attacked on a road.
Yeah, and that kind of thing is kind of strong because it introduces you to different mechanics of the game, which is one of the things that we're talking about. But with the game that we're playing on Fridays, that is a different kind of mechanic, right? What are the other things that let you move through the story that aren't just, I'm going to hit it with a sword?
Exactly. And with ours, you really combined a few concepts. Because D&D and other tabletop RPGs are so interactive, and so there's so many people who are all doing things, so it takes so long, you get the chance to mix a few different openers together, especially because you know that they're dedicated for one session, lest they be shunned by their friends, right? And so you're able to mix a few ideas. And we mixed in, and you mixed in particularly a chance for us to explore the world with your initial description, a chance for us to explore characters with the initial problem, a chance for us to solve that problem, and then the initial twist of once we actually got started in the university, once we had arrived, we were attacked. There was a sudden explosion. Combat started with us disoriented. You had the chance to make use of multiple different important hooks, and more importantly, as you gained our attention with each hook, you were able to move it into the next item so you could maintain this early attention that you would get within the game, and kept us interested up until we really got into the meat of the game rather than necessarily the various intros.
Yeah, and I will also say that, for any tabletop RPG, because you get a chance with your players to talk about, what's happening, before you sit down to the table to do that first narrative piece, you get your first 5 minutes with everybody already invested, which is a real treat. You don't get that necessarily in video games, outside of franchises, right? If you really liked one of the first games, you might already be invested in the next game. But you don't start with I kind of know what this game is about. You tend to start from scratch. And with tabletop RPGs, because you're talking about, okay, we've talked about this world, we know who all of you people are, we've already had big discussions about stuff, and we know that we're going to play. You really get a chance to, kind of show your chops with okay, and how do we step into all of this action that we want to do? So this actually is, I will say, probably the most important part of your game. Aside from lots of the other stuff we talk about, this is really where, your game kind of makes or breaks, right? If you don't set up a mystery at the front end, if you don't set up something that your players want to question, want to follow, an NPC that they're interested in, it's really hard to get people to come back to the table. And it's a lot harder because they don't really have the opportunity to put down the game, because you tend to play with your friends who like you and like playing things. I can just turn off a video game, right? I can just say that's boring for me right now. But when you're playing a tabletop RPG and you want to be invested in it and you're not, that can be really disappointing. So this is a really strong place to make sure everybody's on board with what's happening, right? And this becomes kind of cyclical. Your session 0 tells you what players are interested in, tells you how to hook them into the game, right? But you also get to ask very specific people, What do you like to see? When I did Helenia, we had talked about specifically like what moments in media do you find really, really interesting? So we talked about like, oh, I really love when characters get that like the moment of like the superhero cape, right? I really like the idea of, you know, this particular moment from a movie.
Right.
And you get to play to those things because you're in charge.
Yeah, and that brings us to about time for today's episode. So for the concepts of introductions for hooks and for how to really hook, like get players in within the first 5 minutes, if you take anything away from this, it's that when you start a game, when you start a book, when you start anything, you have to be dynamic, you have to include things that get the player interested, and you have to sell them on your story. And I think that gives us everything. So I know that you, Vi, have a line you wanted to conclude us with. So, I've been Gaia.
I've been Vi.
And let's hear it.
Okay. This is from Gideon the Ninth by Tamsin Muir. In the myriadic year of our Lord, the 10,000th year of the King Undying, the kindly Prince of Death, Gideon Nav packed her sword, her shoes, and her dirty magazines, and she escaped from the house of the Ninth. That's one of my favorite books, and I think you should read it based on that first line.
We'll see you next time. And if you want to hear more from us or listen to past episodes, tune in live every Thursday at 9 p.m. Atlantic on CHSR 97.9 FM in Fredericton, New Brunswick. And if you're online, you can listen live at chsrfm.ca or on your favorite podcast platform. We'll see you next time.